The November rain hammered against the grimy windows of the night bus as Marcus Chen clutched his portfolio case, its leather edges worn from years of hopeful journeys. At 28, his hands bore the calluses of both his security guard shifts and the countless hours spent painting in the converted shed behind his council flat. The bus lurched through East London's sleeping streets, carrying him from his night shift at the warehouse toward Shoreditch, where the Whitmore Contemporary Gallery stood like a beacon of everything he'd never been allowed to touch. Inside the portfolio rested 12 paintings, his entire world compressed into canvas and oil. Each piece had consumed him. The elderly Mrs. Patel watering her balcony garden at sunrise, painted with such tenderness that viewers could feel the morning chill. The night workers at the 24-hour laundrette, their exhaustion rendered in blues so deep they seemed to pulse with unspoken dreams. Children playing football against a graffitied wall, their joy explosive against the urban decay. These weren't just paintings. They were love letters to the invisible people who made London breathe. Marcus had discovered the Whitmore Gallery's open submission call 3 months ago, a rare opportunity for emerging artists to bypass the usual gatekeepers. The $500 submission fee had meant skipping meals, working double shifts, and telling his younger sister Sophie that her university textbooks would have to wait another month. "This is it, Soph," he'd promised her over their mother's photograph in their cramped kitchen. "After this, everything changes." The gallery's pristine white facade appeared through the rain-streaked window. Marcus's stomach twisted as he stood, remembering his father's words before the cancer took him. "They'll never see you as one of them, son. But maybe that's exactly why they need to see what you see." His father had been wrong about many things, but Marcus carried those words like armor as he stepped into the November dawn. Inside, the gallery assistant, a young woman named Chloe with kind eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, accepted his portfolio with genuine interest. "These are quite striking," she murmured, lingering on the painting of the night bus driver, whose loneliness Marcus had captured in the reflection of empty streets in his rearview mirror. "Mrs. Whitmore will review them personally this afternoon." Marcus waited in the gallery's pristine reception area, surrounded by current exhibitions of geometric abstractions and conceptual installations he couldn't begin to understand. A price tag caught his eye: $45,000 for a white canvas with a single black dot. His monthly rent was $800. The disconnect felt like a chasm he'd been foolish to think he could cross. 4 hours later, Eleanor Whitmore emerged, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her black dress as sharp as her reputation. She held his portfolio at arm's length, as if it might stain her manicured fingers. "Mr. Chen," she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of cultural authority, "while your technical skills are adequate, I'm afraid this work is entirely unsuitable for our clientele." She set the portfolio on the reception desk with finality. "Our collectors seek sophistication, innovation, conceptual depth. This," she gestured dismissively, "is illustration at best. Sentimental documentation of the obvious. Art must transcend mere representation." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He saw Chloe's face crumble with second-hand devastation, saw other gallery visitors pause to witness his humiliation. "But the submission guidelines said all styles," he began. "All styles of merit," Eleanor interrupted, already turning away. "I suggest you try the community centers. They sometimes hang local work. Good day, Mr. Chen." Marcus stood frozen as she disappeared into her office, the portfolio heavy in his trembling hands. 5 months of hope evaporating in 5 minutes of judgment. Chloe watched Marcus leave through the gallery's glass doors, his shoulders bent against more than just the rain. Her heart ached with the familiar sting of witnessing another artist crushed by the very institutions that claim to nurture creativity. She'd seen it happen dozens of times in her 2 years at Whitmore Contemporary. But something about Marcus's work, the raw humanity of it, the love evident in every brushstroke, made this rejection feel particularly cruel. As she began processing the morning's submissions for the gallery's digital archive, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw 3 foxes in the garden this morning. Made me think of Dad. Missing you both." Chloe's eyes welled up. Her father had passed 2 years ago, a bus driver who'd worked the night shifts Marcus had painted so lovingly. The painting of the lonely driver had stopped her breath when she'd first seen it. It could have been her father, carrying the weight of a sleeping city on his shoulders. Distracted by memory and emotion, Chloe accidentally uploaded Marcus's portfolio images to the gallery's main Instagram account instead of the private archive. She was documenting rejected submissions for internal review, a cruel catalog of what Eleanor deemed unworthy, but her finger slipped on the touchscreen. 12 paintings went live to Whitmore Contemporary's 100,000 followers with the caption she'd been typing for the archive. Submission number 47, Marcus Chen, Birmingham. Status, not selected. The mistake wouldn't be noticed for 3 hours. Sarah Mitchell, a nurse ending her 12-hour shift at St. Thomas's Hospital, saw the first painting while waiting for her bus. The image of the night workers at the laundrette stopped her mid-scroll. Her own mother had cleaned offices at night for 30 years, coming home as Sarah left for school, ships passing in the hallway of their small flat. She shared it with a single comment, "This is my mother. This is every invisible person who keeps the world running while others sleep." The share rippled outward. James, a construction worker, recognized his grandfather in the painting of the elderly man feeding pigeons at dawn. Maria, a single mother of 3, saw her own exhaustion reflected in the woman waiting for the first morning bus, her cleaning supplies beside her. Within an hour, the images had been shared over 3,000 times. The comments began as a trickle, then became a flood. Finally, someone who sees us. This is the England the galleries never show. My dad worked 40 years in factories, and I've never seen his dignity captured like this. People began sharing their own stories, creating a spontaneous digital memorial to the unseen labor that built their lives. Tommy Richfield, a popular culture critic with 2 million followers, stumbled upon the growing phenomenon. His father had been a night security guard, like Marcus, before a heart attack took him at 53. Tommy's post was simple, but devastating. The Whitmore Gallery rejected these paintings today. They said they lacked sophistication and conceptual depth. I guess truth isn't sophisticated enough for Shoreditch. But look at these comments. Thousands of people seeing their parents, their neighbors, themselves. Isn't that what art is supposed to do? By noon, "They Can't See Us" was trending across Britain. Marcus, sleeping off his night shift in his small flat, had no idea that his rejected paintings were becoming a movement. Sophie, his sister, burst into his room, laptop in hand, tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, wake up. You need to see this." The screen showed thousands of comments, shares, and messages. People were sharing photographs of their own invisible heroes alongside his paintings. A delivery driver in Manchester, a hospital cleaner in Glasgow, a market vendor in Cardiff, all with the same message. We see ourselves in Marcus Chen's work, even if the galleries can't. Eleanor Whitmore discovered the mistake when a journalist from The Guardian called for comment. Her assistant had accidentally made visible what was meant to stay hidden, the very humanity the gallery had rejected. As she watched the numbers climb, her carefully curated world began to crack. The gallery's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Collectors were calling, but not her usual clientele. New voices, angry voices, proud voices, demanding to know why Marcus Chen's work had been rejected. "Take it down immediately," she ordered Chloe, who had just discovered her mistake. But it was too late. The internet had already preserved, shared, and claimed Marcus's work as its own. The crowd had chosen him, even if she hadn't. Marcus stood in his cramped kitchen, Sophie's laptop open on the counter beside him, watching in disbelief as the numbers climbed. 47,000 shares, 200,000 likes, messages from strangers pouring in faster than he could read them. His hands shook as he scrolled through the comments. People sharing photographs of their parents, their stories of night shifts and early mornings, their tears over finally being seen. "They're calling you the people's painter," Sophie said, her voice thick with pride. She was still in her university jumper, having rushed home from her economics lecture when the news exploded. "Look at this one. A woman in Newcastle says she's printing your painting of Mrs. Patel to give to her grandmother. Says it's the first time she's seen someone who looks like her in art." Marcus's phone rang. Unknown number. He'd been ignoring calls all morning, overwhelmed by the attention, but Sophie grabbed it. "Hello? Yes, he's here." She covered the speaker, eyes wide. "It's BBC News. They want to interview you." Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door, then another, then voices in the corridor. Sophie peeked through the peephole. There are reporters outside, at least 5 of them. Marcus felt the walls closing in. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He'd dreamed of gallery openings, of collectors quietly appreciating his work, of gradual recognition. Not this. Not this raw, explosive validation that felt like it might consume him. "I need air," he said, grabbing his father's old coat. He slipped out the back way, muscle memory from years of avoiding debt collectors, and found himself walking toward Shoreditch without conscious thought. As he approached Whitmore Contemporary, he stopped in shock. The pristine white walls were surrounded by people, hundreds of them. Some held printed copies of his paintings. Others had hand-painted reproductions. An elderly Caribbean woman had set up an easel and was copying his laundrette painting in chalk on the pavement. "That's him!" someone shouted. "That's Marcus Chen!" The crowd turned and Marcus froze, but instead of mobbing him, they began to applaud. Slowly at first, then building to thunder. A construction worker in a high-vis vest stepped forward. "My daughter's studying art at university. They keep telling her that real life isn't art, that she needs to be more abstract. You've shown her that's bollocks. Thank you." A woman in nurse's scrubs approached next. "The painting of the night bus driver. That was my dad for 30 years. He died thinking no one noticed him. But you noticed. You saw him." One by one they came forward, not seeking autographs or selfies, but to share their stories. The crowd had become a living gallery, each person a portrait Marcus hadn't painted yet, but suddenly could see in vivid detail. Their faces were etched with the same dignity he'd tried to capture, the beauty of ordinary endurance. Inside the gallery, Eleanor Whitmore watched from her second-floor window. The crowd had been growing since dawn, when the first person, a street cleaner ending his shift, had taped a printed copy of Marcus's work to the gallery's window with a note, "This is my London." Now the entire street was transformed, a guerrilla exhibition that no amount of authority could disperse. "The Guardian, the Times, and the Telegraph have all called," Chloe reported nervously. "Channel 4 wants to do a special, and..." She hesitated. "Sir David Attenborough's office inquired about purchasing the complete collection for a new documentary about modern Britain." Eleanor's phone buzzed. The chairman of the gallery's board. "Eleanor, we need to discuss the situation. The negative publicity is becoming problematic. Fix this." She thought of her 40-year career, built on understanding what art should be. The Whitmore name had been synonymous with taste, with culture, with knowing what mattered. But outside her window, she saw something that challenged everything she'd believed. A Pakistani grandfather was teaching his granddaughter to paint on a scrap of cardboard, copying Marcus's style. A group of night shift workers had brought folding chairs and thermoses of tea, treating the street like their living room. "Mrs. Whitmore," Chloe said quietly, "perhaps we should reconsider." "I don't bend to mob rule," Eleanor snapped. But even as she said it, she wondered if that's what this was. Or was it something else? Democracy in its purest form, art finding its true audience despite the gatekeepers? A new commotion outside drew her attention. Marcus Chen had arrived, looking overwhelmed and exhausted. The crowd parted for him respectfully, creating a path to the gallery door. He stood there, portfolio under his arm, the same portfolio she'd dismissed yesterday, and looked up at her window. Their eyes met across the divide of class and culture and different definitions of worth. Eleanor watched him turn away from the gallery and toward the crowd, setting his portfolio on an overturned crate someone offered him. He pulled out his paintings, the originals, and began displaying them against the gallery's wall, on the street where they apparently belonged. The November wind whipped through Shoreditch as Marcus carefully propped his paintings against the gallery's pristine wall. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of hundreds of eyes watching him. These weren't the eyes of critics or collectors. They were the eyes of the people he'd painted, multiplied into a movement he never intended to start. "Tell us about this one," called out a young man with paint-stained fingers, pointing to the painting of children playing football against the graffitied wall. Marcus cleared his throat, finding his voice. "That's Pemberton Estate, where I grew up. Those kids play there every day after school, same wall my brother and I played against 20 years ago. The council keeps saying they'll tear it down for development, but..." He paused. "Those kids don't care about property values. They just see a goal." An elderly woman pushed forward in her wheelchair, her daughter guiding her. She reached out toward the painting of Mrs. Patel in her garden. "I know her," she whispered. We take the same bus to the hospital for dialysis. Never knew her name until now. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks. Never knew anyone thought we were worth painting. The crowd had grown to nearly 1,000 people. Food vendors drawn by the gathering offered free tea and sandwiches. Musicians appeared with guitars and violins, playing the folk songs of a dozen different homelands. Someone had brought speakers, and grime music mixed with Bengali tabla rhythms and Irish fiddles. Shoreditch hadn't seen anything like it. Not a protest, not a party, but something in between. A celebration of visibility. Inside the gallery, Eleanor paced her office like a caged animal. The board had called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. 30 years building this gallery's reputation, and now she was the curator who'd rejected the people's painter. Her phone showed 53 missed calls from collectors. Not her usual refined clientele, but new money, tech entrepreneurs, and worse, the press. The narrative was already written. Eleanor Whitmore, the elitist who couldn't see beauty in ordinary lives. "Mrs. Whitmore," Chloe knocked tentatively. "There's someone here to see you. Says he's from Christie's auction house." Eleanor's blood chilled. Robert Cunningham from Christie's stood in her gallery, immaculate in his Savile Row suit, studying the chaos outside with calculating eyes. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, "quite the situation you have here." "Robert, I hardly think we're prepared to auction Marcus Chen's complete collection," he interrupted. "Conservative estimate, £2 million. The cultural moment alone guarantees it. The question is," he turned to her with a sharp smile, "do you want to be remembered as the curator who discovered him or rejected him?" Through the window, Eleanor watched Marcus surrounded by the crowd. A little girl had brought her own painting, a crayon drawing of her mother in a shop uniform, and was showing it to him with shy pride. Marcus knelt to her level, studying it with the same intensity Eleanor reserved for masterworks. He said something that made the child beam, then signed her drawing with careful solemnity. "He doesn't even know what he has," Robert continued. "Someone needs to guide him, protect him from himself. He'll sell everything for nothing if left to these people. You could still save this, Eleanor. Announce that the rejection was a misunderstanding. Embrace him now, and history will remember you as the curator who recognized genius despite its humble origins." Eleanor watched Marcus help an elderly man unfold his own painting, a watercolor of the Thames at dawn, painted on cardboard. Marcus examined it carefully, pointing out techniques, teaching without condescension. The crowd had formed an impromptu art school with Marcus at its center, not as a celebrity, but as a fellow traveler. "Get out," Eleanor said quietly. Robert blinked. "I'm sorry. Get out of my gallery." Her voice was steel. "If Marcus Chen chooses to work with you, that's his decision, but I won't be party to your vulture capitalism." After Robert left, Eleanor stood alone in her empty gallery, surrounded by the kind of art she'd spent her life promoting. Conceptual, challenging, important. But through the window came the sound of life itself. Singing, laughing, crying, sharing. She thought of her own father, a coal miner who died when she was 7. She'd spent 40 years trying to distance herself from those origins, to prove she belonged in these rarefied spaces. Her phone rang. Her daughter, calling from New York where she worked as a human rights lawyer. "Mom, I've been watching the news. The whole world is watching what's happening outside your gallery. I suppose you think I should have exhibited his work." There was a pause. "I think you should ask yourself why you didn't, and whether grandfather would have seen himself in those paintings." Eleanor ended the call and walked to her window again. The crowd had lit candles as evening fell, creating a constellation of light around Marcus's paintings. Someone had projected images of his work onto the gallery's white wall, 10 feet tall, impossible to ignore. Mrs. Patel's garden bloomed across the pristine surface, larger than life, magnificent in its ordinary glory. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Shoreditch, but the crowd outside Whitmore Contemporary had only grown. They'd stayed through the night, taking shifts, bringing blankets and fold-out chairs, transforming the street into something between a vigil and a festival. Marcus had tried to leave several times, exhausted and overwhelmed, but each time someone new would arrive with their story, their child's drawing, their parents' photograph, and he would stay. Sophie had brought him fresh clothes and strong coffee at 3 a.m., finding her brother surrounded by a group of art students who'd traveled from Manchester to meet him. "You need to sleep," she'd insisted. But Marcus had just shaken his head. "They've been invisible their whole lives, Soph. Least I can do is see them now." Inside the gallery, Eleanor Whitmore sat in the boardroom, facing 5 stern faces across the polished table. The board of directors had arrived early, their displeasure palpable. Chairman Jeffrey Pemberton, whose family money had helped establish the gallery, spoke first. 40,000 signatures on a petition demanding we exhibit Mr. Chen's work. The hashtag #TheYCan'tSeeUs has been used 12 million times globally. The Prime Minister tweeted about it. Eleanor, the Prime Minister. "Since when do we let social media dictate our curatorial decisions?" Eleanor responded, though her voice lacked its usual authority. "Since it started affecting our funding," another board member interjected. 3 major sponsors have already expressed concern. They don't want to be associated with," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "cultural elitism." Through the boardroom's glass wall, Eleanor could see the main gallery space where her current exhibition hung, a collection of minimalist sculptures that had received glowing reviews in all the right publications. But the gallery was empty except for Chloe, who was staring out the window at the crowd, tears running down her face. "What would you have me do?" Eleanor asked. "Abandon 40 years of curatorial standards because of a mob?" "That mob," Jeffrey said quietly, "includes my grandson. He's out there with a painting he made of his mother, my daughter, who you might remember died of cancer last year. She was a nurse, Eleanor, worked nights to put herself through medical school, the kind of person Mr. Chen paints." The room fell silent. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, a fault line she'd spent decades cementing over. Outside, a new commotion was building. 3 black SUVs had pulled up, and a woman in an elegant coat stepped out. Eleanor recognized her immediately. Lady Catherine Morgan, one of the most influential collectors in Europe, patron of the Venice Biennale, owner of a collection worth hundreds of millions. But instead of entering the gallery, Lady Catherine walked directly to Marcus. The crowd parted respectfully as she approached. She studied each painting slowly, deliberately, with the kind of attention Eleanor had only seen her give to Picassos and Pollocks. "Mr. Chen," Lady Catherine said, her voice carrying in the morning air, "my mother was a seamstress, worked in a factory in Leeds for 40 years. She died thinking her life hadn't mattered, that beauty was something that happened to other people." She pointed to the painting of the night workers at the laundrette. "May I purchase this?" Marcus looked uncomfortable. They're not really for sale like that. I mean, I don't even know what to charge." "Whatever you think it's worth," Lady Catherine said simply. Marcus thought of his father, of Sophie's university fees, of all the nights he'd painted instead of sleeping. £500, he suggested tentatively. Lady Catherine smiled. "I'll pay 50,000, and that's insulting low." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of generations of privilege now wielded like a weapon against itself. "The art world has forgotten that all great art comes from truth. Mr. Chen hasn't just painted portraits. He's painted a mirror in which we can all see ourselves if we're brave enough to look." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "James." "Yes, it's Catherine. Clear the main room at the Morgan Foundation. We're hosting an exhibition." "Yes, all of them." "Mr. Chen's complete collection." The crowd erupted. Eleanor watched from the boardroom window as Lady Catherine spoke with Marcus, no doubt explaining that the Morgan Foundation's gallery was one of the most prestigious spaces in London, that an exhibition there would launch him into the stratosphere of the art world. "It seems the decision has been made for us," Jeffrey said quietly. "The question now is whether Whitmore Contemporary can survive being on the wrong side of history." Eleanor stood up, her body feeling every one of her 63 years. "If you'll excuse me, I have something to do." She walked through her gallery, past the expensive, important art that suddenly seemed as lifeless as the white walls that held it. At the entrance, she hesitated, her hand on the door handle. Outside was everything she'd defined herself against: mess, emotion, unfiltered humanity. Inside was everything she'd built: order, sophistication, control. She opened the door. The cold air hit her like a slap, carrying the smell of street food and unwashed bodies and life itself. The crowd turned to look at her, and she saw their anger, their hurt, their vindication. She walked through them, their silence following her like a wave, until she stood in front of Marcus Chen. Eleanor stood before Marcus, aware of hundreds of eyes upon her, cameras recording, the weight of 40 years of carefully constructed identity crumbling around her shoulders. Marcus looked exhausted, paint still under his fingernails from a lifetime of work, his eyes holding a mixture of wariness and something she couldn't quite name, perhaps pity. "Mr. Chen," she began, her voice catching. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Mr. Chen, I owe you an apology." The crowd fell completely silent. Someone killed the music. Even the morning traffic seemed to pause. "Yesterday, I told you your work lacked sophistication and conceptual depth. I was wrong." Her voice grew stronger, finding truth in confession. "I've spent my entire career believing that art should elevate us above ordinary life. But I see now that I had it backwards. The greatest art doesn't lift us above life. It returns us to it." She turned to address the crowd, seeing faces that reminded her of memories she'd buried. "My father was a coal miner in Yorkshire. He died when I was 7, his lungs full of dust, his hands permanently blackened. Spent my whole life trying to escape that shadow, to prove I belonged in galleries like this one. In doing so, I became blind to the very beauty I should have been celebrating." Her voice broke. Chloe appeared at her elbow with a tissue, and Eleanor realized she was crying, something she hadn't done in public since her father's funeral. "Your paintings, Mr. Chen," she continued, "they don't lack sophistication. They possess something far rarer, truth without pretense. They show us that dignity isn't granted by institutions like mine, but inherent in every person who gets up each day and does what needs to be done." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, "Why now? Because Lady Catherine Morgan is here? Because the cameras are watching?" Eleanor flinched at his directness. "Perhaps that's part of it," she admitted. "But standing here, seeing all of you, seeing how your work has brought people together, I realize I've been curating emptiness. Beautiful, expensive emptiness." An elderly man in the crowd called out, "Words are easy, love. What are you going to do about it?" Eleanor turned to face him. "You're right. Words aren't enough." She looked back at Marcus. "The Whitmore Contemporary Gallery would be honored to host your first solo exhibition. Full gallery, proper promotion, opening gala. Everything I should have offered yesterday." The crowd began murmuring, some approving, others skeptical. But Marcus shook his head. "Thank you, but Lady Catherine has already offered." "I know," Eleanor interrupted, "and you should take it. The Morgan Foundation will do right by you in ways I'm not sure I know how to anymore. But I'm not making this offer to save my gallery or my reputation. I'm making it because I need to learn." She gestured to the crowd. "All of you have stories, visions, art that I've been trained not to see. If you'll let me, I want to learn to see again. The Whitmore Contemporary will reserve half its space permanently for artists like Mr. Chen, artists who tell the stories that matter, regardless of where they come from or where they studied." "How do we know you won't go back to your old ways once the cameras leave?" Sophie asked, stepping protective beside her brother. Eleanor considered the question. "You don't. All I can offer is accountability. A community board, with members chosen from among you, to oversee submissions and exhibitions. My voice would be one among many." Lady Catherine Morgan spoke up. "I'll fund it. A proper endowment, ensuring the gallery can afford to take risks on unknown artists without worrying about sales." The crowd began discussing among themselves, a dozen languages mixing in the morning air. Marcus remained silent, studying Eleanor's face as if it were a canvas he was trying to understand. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Patel, the woman in my garden painting. She used to be a teacher in Mumbai before she came here. Now she cleans offices. She's been painting in secret for 20 years, hidden in her flat where no one could tell her she wasn't a real artist." He paused. "Would you exhibit her work?" "If it speaks truth like yours does, yes." "And Tommy, the kid who does graffiti portraits on the South Bank?" "Yes. And my sister Sophie. She writes poetry about growing up between two worlds, too British for our grandparents, too foreign for—" "Yes," Eleanor said firmly. "Yes to all of them." Marcus turned to the crowd. "What do you think? Do we trust her?" The debate that followed was democracy in its rawest form. Voices raised in anger and hope, skepticism and possibility. The street cleaner who'd started it all by taping Marcus's print to the window spoke last. "I say we give her a chance. But we watch." We hold her accountable, and if she fails us, we come back." The crowd seemed to agree with this, a cautious hope rippling through them. Marcus extended his hand to Eleanor. "All right, but I still want my first show at the Morgan Foundation. This isn't about me anymore. It's about all of us being seen." Eleanor shook his hand, feeling the calluses against her manicured fingers. "I understand. And Mr. Chen, would you consider being an advisor for our new community program? Help us choose artists. Help me learn to see what you see?" Marcus looked surprised. "You want me to teach you, if you're willing." As the sun finally broke through the November clouds, bathing the street in unexpected warmth, Marcus smiled, the first real smile Eleanor had seen from him. "My dad always said the best teachers are the ones who remember they're still students." 3 months later, the Morgan Foundation glowed with golden light as February snow fell softly outside. Inside, warmth radiated from hundreds of hearts finally seen. Marcus Chen stood before his collection, but more importantly, before the people who'd inspired it. Mrs. Patel in her finest sari, tears streaming as her grandchildren saw her transformed into art. Robert Williams, the retired bus driver, standing tall before his portrait like the king Marcus had always seen in him. The room pulsed with life. The street cleaner who'd sparked the revolution wore his first new suit in 20 years. Sophie Chen glowed in her poetry-embroidered dress. Tommy's graffiti art now graced the foundation's walls. But the true miracle stood in the corner. Eleanor Whitmore, transformed, her eyes soft as she watched the celebration of everything she'd once dismissed. "You did it," Lady Catherine announced from the podium. "These works, valued at millions, but Marcus has decided they belong to everyone." Marcus interrupted gently. "The National Portrait Gallery will house them permanently, free admission, forever. They'll be called the Unseen, because everyone deserves to be seen." The room erupted. Through tears, Eleanor saw herself in Marcus's final painting, not the gatekeeper she'd been, but a woman finding her way home through art's true purpose, reflecting our shared humanity. Marcus approached her quietly. "I want to paint your father, the miner, from your memories. He deserves to be seen too." Eleanor's breath caught. This young man she'd rejected had become her teacher, showing her that art's greatest power wasn't in its sophistication, but in its truth. "Yes," she whispered. Outside, London sprawled in all its complexity, the powerful and powerless, visible and invisible. But tonight, in this sacred moment, they were all here, all seen, all valued. The curator who'd refused to hang his work now stood as his student. The crowd that chose him had rewritten history. As snow continued falling, Marcus was already envisioning his next painting, Eleanor at her desk, learning to see again, her father's cold, darkened hands finally visible, guiding her toward the light that had always been there, waiting in the ordinary sublime of everyday grace. The revolution hadn't been televised. It had been painted with love, one invisible life at a time, until the world had no choice but to see.